All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for pros and cons. And you know this segment. It's when I bring on a conservative writer, a conservative activist, a conservative political professional, an individual that you may know from Twitter is on this week, Siraj, Hashmi, Habibis, and Habibtis. It is my pleasure to welcome him on the show. Siraj, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Brad. I appreciate the shout out to the Habibis and the Habibtis. How you holding up during this quarantine?
Dude, I'm holding up as best we can. I think everyone's kind of in that same boat right now. Cabin fever is a little, getting a little bit of the best of them, but we keep this thing rolling. We're doing this podcast once a week, and thank you so much for joining us. I know
Happy
that
to be here.
you've got a lot to talk to us about. We're going to talk a little bit about coronavirus and the election. We're going to be talking about your Mad List, and we're also going to be talking about what you've been up to over at the Washington Examiner. So thank you again for joining us. So first off, I want you to tell our listeners a little bit of your background information on who you are and how you got involved in, I guess, the political commentary business. I know most of our listeners know you from Twitter, your great Twitter feed and presence. I mean, that's where I first met you. So it's a question I wanted to ask you myself, and I think the viewers want to hear it too. So where did you get your start? Where did you get involved?
So it's to make a long story short. Essentially, what happened was I graduated college in 2009, and actually was trying to go to medical school. So I graduated from Dickinson College in 2009, went to Georgetown University for a post-bac pre-med program. And then I worked in the DC area for a couple of years at the sleep lab, trying to work my way to getting into medical school. And then after one application cycle, I pretty much just had it. I didn't have the drive to keep doing it. So I thought I tried a few different things, tried teaching, tried selling insurance, and I also tried my hand at broadcasting. And it originally started as sports journalism because I actually wanted to be a sports journalist and very passionate about sports. Um, and essentially, worked at one startup that focused on high school sports in the DC area. This is around 2013, 2014, and I used whatever reel I got from there and moved over to the next startup, which focused on millennial news, and that was kind of where I started getting a little bit more traction. I got hired at the same time by SiriusXM Radio by their POTUS channel, which is their nonpartisan talk channel. And I worked at those two gigs until 2016, and then I got picked up by Red Alert Politics, which was an independent website that's affiliated with the Washington Examiner and then the Weekly Standard, and then it got absorbed into the Examiner as a vertical. Once it got absorbed by the Examiner into a vertical in 2017, essentially what happened was they were going to let go three of the four paid employees, and I wasn't that one person. So I got picked up by the Examiner to on their commentary desk to create video, and so my title now is commentary video editor and writer. I started off doing a lot more commentary pieces, like written pieces, but it's since sort of evolved to just doing video and now podcasting. And so that's kind of how I got to where I am. It's just, it's a slow grind, and things didn't happen overnight for me. I sort of had to work my way up. And if I had any advice to, the next generation or whoever's trying to come up is, schooling isn't always the best thing. A lot of times you can just learn the skills needed to do what needs to be done and be successful in this industry just by taking whatever shots are out there, whatever opportunities are extended to you, saying yes to them and just knocking it out of the park.
Yeah, I think that you give a lot of great advice in that little tidbit. And, for me, sports radio is a major influence on how I do this podcast, right? I listen to
Mhm.
a few hours of sports talk radio every single day. When I'm not listening to politics, I'm listening to sports radio. I'm listening to The Herd with Colin Cowherd. I like to emulate, or at least try to, and to the best of my ability, emulate his interview style, because I think it's analytical interviews, right? He's not just letting the interviewer take up all the time. He's giving his positions and engaging a little bit more in a two-way conversation instead of just having a one-sided approach. So I really appreciate that. Also, DC high school sports, I mean, those guys can ball. I know a few
Yeah,
guys.
and it was mostly football and basketball, and there are some freak athletes out here. It's actually kind of crazy how little attention was paid to DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And it's actually kind of wild seeing some of the players that I interviewed back in high school are now becoming pretty successful in the pros. It's weird. It's a weird time to be alive, I gotta say.
Yeah, and I think that that's totally true. I mean, I went to Orange Lutheran High School, so that's in the Trinity League. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's modern day St. John Bosco.
Okay.
It's where Carson Palmer came out of. It's where Josh
Oh,
Rosen
yeah, yeah.
came out of. It's where a bunch of really successful guys came out of. And that sports beat is intense. And you hear about California, you hear about De La
Yeah.
Salle and California, and you hear about Florida. And you hear about
Yeah, in
Texas,
Texas.
but
Yeah.
you don't hear about the DMV and Gonzaga. They can ball, man. But enough of
Yeah.
that for now.
And
I think that
NASA.
yep, and I think you give a really great uh, piece of advice, because that's what I've been trying to do is you keep your arms open to opportunity when they come your way, and it's put you in a fantastic spot because you learn the best from experience, and I
Yeah.
truly believe that. And
And this is where I think a lot of people could probably learn is that never think that any job is beneath you.
Mhm.
You sometimes you might think you might be doing grunt work. You might have to swallow your pride a bit, but those are the things that make you more qualified and attractive to potential employers because you're willing to do the things that other people won't. And that makes you more versatile. I mean, I think the reason why I got to where I was is simply just by saying yes to every single opportunity that was out there.
Yeah, and you mentioned this a little bit. You have a relatively new podcast over at the Washington Examiner called Hashing It Out. You actually started up your podcast right around when we started up ours. So you host it, you do the whole thing. So tell us a little bit about that project, what you've been working on over there.
Sure. So I had the idea last summer to sort of start getting into podcasting because um, I had seen a lot of podcasts out there. My brother and I were driving uh, down to rural Virginia for like a weekend family vacation with my folks and my two sisters and their respective families. And we were listening to a few podcasts. One of them was New York Times Daily. Another one was Deconstructed by Mehdi Hassan. And I was just like, there are a lot of left-leaning podcasts that have like these very polished, developed, well-produced interview styles with people talking about really fascinating issues that you actually learn something from it. And I'm like, I don't really see that much on, at least on the anywhere right of center. And I think it just sort of got I sort of got the idea that like maybe what if there's something out there that I could at least provide so that when people listen to it, they actually learn something from it. It's not just like me pontificating like a Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh. It's something where people actually can develop some historical context for what's happening in our news today. And so originally started off with just, taking some of these bigger issues and just getting to, all right, here's how did we get here? The very first episode we released was on immigration and where things started off, at least in the early 20th century, with immigration laws to how we got to where we are now. Because now, immigration is such a hot topic, especially with President Trump being in office. And that's one of the things he's been more hawkish on. And I think if people actually understand where our history was in terms of what our policy was on immigration, they'd have a better understanding of what's happening today. So that was sort of like the whole inspiration behind it. And I think it was something that really brought me to sort of wanting to do this more. So then I went into gun control. Then I went into even things like when Jeffrey Epstein, died from suicide
Oh, you
and all
almost
the
said the thing you
conspiracy
shouldn't have
theories.
said. You almost said
It, what was that? What was
you
that I almost
almost you
said? That he
almost said
killed
he got
himself?
murdered. I don't know. I don't want
That
to
he
put words
didn't
in your
kill
mouth.
himself? No, I mean it's funny because there are a lot of suspect things about this particular case because I just had to say I had one of my colleagues, Jerry Dunleavy, another reporter at the Washington Examiner, sort of break down exactly what happened in this particular case, like why he got arrested, what he was accused of doing, what happened with his 2008 work release that allowed him to continue to abuse more and more people, and how it all led to this. And that's still, I think, by far right now is my most listened to episode because people just don't know the full story. They want to learn the full story. That can't obviously. Jerry and I didn't know the full story then, and I would pretty much guarantee that we don't know the full story now. But that's the type of thing that I at least want to try to provide is give some people some understanding in a short span of time, like well, what is going on. And so each episode is focused on one issue. It doesn't get into we try not to get into like too many issues unless I'm sitting down with a lawmaker because I have no idea how many times I'm going to get a chance to sit down with them. So I had over the last few months had Devin Nunes, Senator Kevin Cramer, Mike Braun from Indiana, and Lance Gooden from Texas, and I think we all had a very good conversation on all of them, trying to expand as well. I'd love to get more Democrats on. I'd love to get more progressives on and liberals because I think it's important to at least present their side to some of the conservatives out there, or a conservative audience, to get an understanding of what it is they feel is most important, and maybe get a chance to push back on some of their positions and get them really to provide a good defense for why they believe what they believe.
And I think that's a great way to approach podcasting. The way that I talk to people about why I'm doing a podcast, right, is that conservatives have long dominated talk radio.
Right.
Talk radio is fundamentally different than what you're going to be presented in a podcast. The left, at the beginning, started dominating this podcast wave. You had Pod Save, you had Pod Save America, Pod Save the World. You had those podcasts that you mentioned, Deconstructed and the New York Daily. And I think that we are craving some more long format, deeper conversations on the right presented in the podcast form. And you saw this early on, I think, with Ben Shapiro's show a little bit more. But now Ben Shapiro has been taken up by talk radio, and he's shifting the way that he messages. And that's, of course, you sometimes miss the deeper analytical dives that he used to do. But at the same time, he's doing talk radio. He's doing a talk radio show. You have to understand the medium and the audience that you're approaching when you're doing these types of things. So I think that you're filling a crucial void. And here ours is a little bit more segmented. We do try to go in on depth, but it's a for college and by college student podcast, so our focus is a little bit more campus. And actually, this quarantine has been interesting because without any campus issues, I've been able to open up and bring people on like Lindsay Wygo, like Tyler Grant, like yourself, and have these longer format conversations. And I think that's a really, really valuable space. So now let's shift to the more substantive issues, shall we? A little segue into getting into the meat of the matter. So us over here at the elephant in the room, we've been keeping tabs on the coronavirus and the federal government's response and government response in general. That's an understatement, I guess. I feel like we've devoted a lot of airtime, as we should, to the coronavirus. Siraj, I don't remember the federal government responding well to a single crisis in the 21st century. Maybe you can prove me wrong here, and that is in part because I think the American system isn't really made to function this way, function fast and well in a crisis beyond national defense, and I think that's for good reason, and that's a deeper philosophical point that we can touch on later. But what do you make so far of the government's response? I mean, let's first break this into two parts on the federal level, right? Give us your thoughts on the Trump administration's response, and then give us your thoughts on the legislative branch's response with the stimulus package, and maybe give a letter grade for each.
I would say right now the federal government response. I would probably give it a C plus, B minus. I think it's been okay. I mean, the thing is that I think there are certain things that have happened that were too little, too late, and I think the federal government was handicapped by the fact that the Chinese government lied to the World Health Organization, which then basically spread that lie across the world. So there was never really an opportunity to say. Fully prepare ourselves for a pandemic. At the same time, You have reports about White House trade advisor Peter Navarro warning President Trump about a pandemic on the horizon in January. You have President Trump shutting down travel with China for all non-U.S. citizens. So, I mean, that's something, but I don't think that travel ban was really fully implemented because you're still letting people who are U.S. citizens back into the country, and they could very well have carried the coronavirus with them back from places like Wuhan. Um, so, I mean, I would probably downgrade it even more, probably to just a C, because I honestly, I don't know how better they could have responded to it, but I think there are things that, say, like messaging in the beginning from President Trump and kind of dismissing it as just the flu. We don't really know, and that's the thing is I think there's a lot of uncertainty about this in the sense that you can't. This is they call it novel coronavirus for a reason. It's novel. We have never seen this before. This is the second respiratory severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS for short, that we've seen of this particular coronavirus strand. There's no vaccine. We've been trying to figure out exactly how we can combat against a virus that has been very contagious and has been rapidly reducing the health of a lot of people who are immunocompromised and elderly, and then even some perfectly healthy people in, say, like their 20s and 30s. There have been people around my age who have died from coronavirus that, maybe they have had health complications, but that's been further accelerated. They further deteriorated because they contracted the virus. Um, I think the one bright side I think is that um, Trump is taking it seriously now, and there are just times in which I'm wondering though how much he really believes it or how much he's relying on his experts and how much this is actually we're going to look back on this and say, oh, he handled this well. This was actually a good response. I mean, majority of American people, at least in the first ABC News Washington Post poll in late March, gave him a positive approval rating, which is the first time that's ever happened in his presidency. I think that's a little. I think in the last week and a half, we've seen that sort of gone down a bit. But you know, I I would not. I'm cautiously optimistic that the federal government has the best interest in mind of the American people. And I'm really hesitant to sort of criticize President Trump's intentions or where his mind is at right off the bat, just because I don't fully know them. Um, but I'm very that's why this whole time has just been sort of insane because there are a lot of people who are sort of assigning what they believe President Trump's thoughts to be or what he's trying to do, whether he's trying to become a dictator, whether he's trying to basically, suspend all of our rights and implement martial law. Like I just don't think there's whole lot of accuracy to that. But at the same time, you see a bunch of people on the right who are criticizing Trump for, allowing, say, doctors Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx to sort of become president of the United States by simply telling him their advice. And I think, and then kind of casting off as a hoax, I think that's a little bit misplaced. And so I honestly, it's a lot of mixed emotions and it's a mixed bag. And I don't know what the right answer is. And that's why I probably would say the federal government response has been average at best.
And I think that's why you're on. We're hashing it out as we speak, and it really is a mixed. It really is a mixed bag because you look at the early days and how certain legislators and the president didn't take this thing nearly seriously enough, even though he did take action, right? And we on my show we've spent a lot of time debunking a lot of the lies coming from the left, right? And a lot of those lies are projection of Donald Trump's emotional psyche or where his head's at when he's dealing with this type of crisis. Don't play that game, media. You're going to lose that game. You don't have any evidence for that game. It's all purely speculative, and that's why the American people largely don't trust you. And I think that that's a game that political commentators like you and I should refrain from, right? Just look at what's happening on the ground, criticize the actions taken, and instead of impugning motives look on whether or not they're being effective, because that's the number one litmus test I think that we can look at to see whether or not the president is evaluating this in a serious way. And obviously he's taking it very seriously now, and that's a good positive thing. And another aspect of this that I wanted to bring up with you that I don't think is being talked about nearly enough, or at least isn't being focused on, right? There's a reason that my question was leading with the federal government's response, that we've been so wrapped up in Trump and who Trump is and his coronavirus task force press briefings that we're not focusing on the states and the governors in this pandemic. How would you grade some of these governors? We can talk about Hogan in Maryland. We can talk about Cuomo. We can talk about Newsom. How would you say these governors are doing? These states are doing in the pandemic? How would you grade them on fulfilling their responsibilities and their relationship to the federal government in this crisis? Because the federal government is hamstrung by the powers that is given to it by the Constitution, right? I mean, we look at this and say, well, the government's response has been average. The federal government's response has been average, and I think that's partially by design, right? The states have the utmost priority in solving issues like this, and the federal government can basically combat this based on broad executive powers and the powers granted them in regulating interstate commerce. What do you think? How do you think these governors are doing? What do you make of that point?
Yeah, I don't think any governor has done it perfectly. I think Cuomo, Newsom, Hogan in Maryland, Northam, and Whitmer have done a decent job, but like they're obviously the few governors who have done a terrible job, and that's like Brian Kemp in Georgia and Ron DeSantis in Florida. I think they acted way too late to sort of implement these shelter-in-place orders, and at the same time, I think New York obviously got hit really hard because it's the biggest city in the country, and you're having people living on top of each other. It's very hard for that disease, that virus, not to spread the way it has. And essentially, I think some of these governors have done the best that they could with what they had. But when you have people like Brian Kemp and Ron DeSantis, Brian Kemp in particular, so basically saying, "Oh, we didn't know that asymptomatic people with coronavirus can pass the disease over to, or the virus over to people, say, who are immunocompromised or elderly, and cause basically their deterioration of health." That's just plain ignorant. Like, where have you been? This only happened like last week that he admitted this. And then DeSantis sort of shutting down beaches only within the last week, like that. Like, where were you before that? This is unacceptable. So, and I do think, like, some of these guys, Cuomo and Newsom in particular, sort of stood out as being sort of like the leaders of the Democratic Party at this point, because they've at least had a very aggressive style of trying to clamp down on these shelter-in-place orders. But it's very hard for, say, some people who live in, say, very crowded apartment buildings to sort of, or even situations where, say, like there's a lot of domestic violence, for example. Like it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think in terms of, say, like a lot of these rural states in the middle of the country, you don't have the same situation because people are spread out so far away. And maybe sheltering in place for them isn't the best solution. And even bringing up that question kind of turns you into like a coronavirus truther, which isn't really the case. But you're going to see a lot of these big cities, these urban hubs in which people are catching disease much quickly just because there are more people per square mile of that particular city. I think at the very least, these governors demanding at least PPEs, at the very least ventilators, got to keep the demand up, or at least press the government for these items. PPEs are obviously way more, I think, important than ventilators at this point, because once you're on a ventilator, that's the mortality rate is much higher for someone who's on the ventilator. That's someone who's basically having a lot more trouble having oxygen absorbed into their bloodstream from their lungs. They're having a lot more trouble breathing, and just the prognosis of them making it out after being on a ventilator goes down, and the best the best way to combat this is by protecting yourself from contracting the virus first off, and that's why people who go outside to the store should wear masks. They should wear gloves. They should make sure they shower when they get home. Take off all your clothes. This is the thing. I don't think people take enough personal responsibility for how much they can probably contribute to the spread of the virus. Is that they don't realize, say, like what's on this shirt. If I go outside and the shoes I'm wearing, I'm taking the shoes off when I come inside, and I'm changing to a different pair because I know that this could probably track whatever, say, into the house. If somebody sneezed on the floor in the grocery store, like, and I don't know, I stepped in it, I could potentially be tracking that virus into the house. So you got to just like make sure you clean everything you possibly can. And I think first and foremost, as soon as people take personal responsibility for that and take this seriously, I think the further along we'll be in flattening that curve.
And I think you make a great point about the ventilators. We, as much as these states need ventilators, we should be working on steps to make sure that people don't get to that place in the first place, right?
Right.
And I also think that you make a really good point of talking about bucking personal responsibility. Oftentimes, I have this thing that we talk about a lot on the podcast called the big government binary, right? Where the bucking of personal responsibility and the collapse of civil society has entrenched us more in our politics, and that means that when these types of pandemics come up, or when these types of crises come up, we're so focused on the political aspect that we're not focusing enough what civil society can do with what our communities and with what us personally can do to help in the long run, right? The response of the federal government, and that means, in this circumstance, taking social distancing seriously, taking masks and gloves to the store, changing your clothes, taking a shower. I know that I have to go and work for my father. He owns a small business and he sells cleaning product, which is why we're still open. But after I come home from work, I'm hopping straight into the shower. Those clothes go into the wash because I live, my grandmother lives with us, and we need to make sure that she's safe because she is right in the age demographic where she can be very, very harmed by this disease, obviously, if not die.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, just taking these things seriously, I think, is a really, really important point, because if you want to see the government do better, it starts with you, right? You can do better as well.
Yeah, I think for a lot of conservatives and libertarians, I would say that the first thing that they think of when it comes to, fulfilling their personal philosophy or their political philosophy is personal responsibility. I would say that probably more, I would say more liberals than say progressives agree with that notion too. And this is a problem where I have where I probably disagree with a lot more progressives on this, is that the reliance on the federal government, or expanding the role of the federal government into, say, jumping into action to combat things and being basically our savior. Look, government isn't always going to be there, and they're not always going to be our savior. And we've known this from time and time again, that after, many, say, natural disasters and the federal government's response to it, we had, there are just some things that they can't do right 100% of the time. And you really test that theory about how efficient they are when a disaster, say, or a pandemic like this happens.
Right. If the government is so garbage at responding to a pandemic like this, and I guess they'll put it at the feet of the orange man, right? But if government's so garbage in responding to things like this, why would you want more of it? Right? I mean, in Katrina, there were folks on their jet skis saving people, saving stray dogs, saving things like that. The federal government's response there, again, lackluster. It goes
Yeah,
beyond.
and it also makes
Trump.
You also make a strong argument against, say, expanding Medicare, or doing Medicare for all, or single payer, when you look at the two biggest federal government health centers, VA, Veterans Affairs, as well as IHS, Indian Health Center, or Indian Health Service, really, they have a plethora of problems that we've seen over the last few years, with the VA scandal during the Obama administration, with veterans not getting the care that they need and being basically in waiting lines until they can't take it and either die or they take their own life, unfortunately. And then um, a lot of the incompetence and sort of like the unqualified medical professionals that have caused a lot of patient suffering and mortality at these IHS facilities in Indian country. That really, once you start nationalizing everything, you're going to see the quality of care start to go down. And unfortunately, we're starting to see the quality of care go down just because you're getting people who are unqualified healthcare professionals trying to treat patients with very delicate and special needs when they are combating coronavirus.
And I think you bring up a really good point about nationalizing healthcare industry, right? We talk about a monetary policy trilemma for you econ geeks. There is a trilemma when we talk about healthcare. You can have universality, you can have affordability, and you can have quality, right? If you want universality and you want quality, you're going to have to raise taxes like crazy. If you want universality and affordability, there will be sacrifices made in the quality of your healthcare. And that's precisely what we've seen play out in the IHS and the VA system. So let's shift a little bit. Let's shift gears to the impact of the coronavirus response on 2020. John Yoo had a fantastic piece over at the National Review called Pandemic Federalism, and his thesis is that because the federal government's mandate is limited in solving a crisis like this, but the states are not. The states have a much broader, more powerful mandate in helping alleviate crises like this. And I think that there's a lot of credence to his argument. And he goes on to say that because the states have more power, they, in a funny and strange way, right, the good response of a Democratic governor may play positively for Trump come November 2020. So how do you think this whole coronavirus response on every level of government in the United States plays for Donald Trump in November? I know you mentioned the poll ratings that Donald Trump received a overwhelmingly positive review of his coronavirus response early on, and those numbers are now ticking down a little bit. How do you think this plays in November on every level of government for Trump?
Look, if the economy bounces back, which a lot of economists and market analysts predict, then I think Trump is probably more likely going to win re-election. If this whole pandemic happened in October and you had the economy shrink by a third, or at least the stock market shrink by a third, and cause millions of jobless claims, I think we're over 12 million jobless claims or something like that.
Yep.
Then Trump, I think, would probably lose his reelection bid. And that's just by circumstance. I think it would be a very slim loss, but I think he would probably still lose just because I think people will look at his performance and saying that there were things that he could have done to prevent the spread of this virus and creating a pandemic. But ultimately, it's not fully his responsibility. It's not fully his responsibility. There are some things that he could have done, obviously. I think there is still a lot of time for him to recover, and I still think that he could probably have a sub 50 approval rating and still win re-election pretty comfortably. Bernie Sanders just dropped out of the presidential race, so now you're seeing Joe Biden, the presumptive nominee, basically reestablishing that the establishment always wins, at least in the Democratic Party. But when it goes up against Trump, I mean, look, he's Hillary 2.0. And unfortunately for him, he's going to have to deal with a lot of the baggage that he's had to deal with over the last year. I mean, he's one of the reasons why Democrats decided they wanted to impeach Trump was because of his dealings with the Ukrainian government and his role in firing Viktor Shokin, the Ukrainian prosecutor there. And his son Hunter Biden's dealings. So
where is Hunter?
look fat. Where's Hunter? The thing is, his handling of the coronavirus now, I think, has been good enough for him to use this to campaign on. And while I hate to say that politics sort of dictates or determines everything, ultimately we're looking at reality here, and we know for a fact that whatever once we get past this, and we will get past this, uh, you can almost assuredly see Trump using this experience to elevate himself politically. And you can look at, say, his dealings with Andrew Cuomo and Gavin Newsom as ways of saying, look, I was able to work across the aisle with some of these, rabid Trump critics and get them the federal resources that they needed when they called on it, and didn't put up a huge fight. And of course, there are going to be people that say, oh, but what about the Michigan governor, Governor Whitmer? Um, he probably would, I'm sure there will be a way for him to dodge that. I think at the end of the day, whatever he does now, this would be like Obama's Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy response when he and Chris Christie sort of hugged it out, and that happened in October. If Superstorm Sandy never happened, we would be in the second term of Mitt Romney right now. Like I fully believe that.
And I think that the poll numbers kind of bear that out, especially as they approached election time, right? Romney was leading in the polls, or at least very, very competitive within the margin of error, and then Obama ended up pulling away in the in the approval rating pollings as we approached election time. So I think that that's a great point. You mentioned Joe Biden. Let's shift gears to Joe Biden. Okay,
Sure.
so I got a little conspiracy theory for you that
Oh God.
this coronavirus actually plays well for the Joe Biden campaign. Obviously, the Joe Biden campaign, I'm not saying that they're happy that there is a pandemic, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that with the gaff machine chugging along, him campaigning from home, him having a podcast that's more edited, that's more controlled, being able to have his messaging more controlled, not having to go through the long spring and summer months of campaigning nationally, which wears you down like no other. I mean, we saw this take a pretty substantial toll on Hillary Clinton's health, right? And I don't think anyone really took that seriously at the time, but it is a very large concern when your presidential candidate faints after working tirelessly on the campaign. And Hillary Clinton, I think, was in much better mental and physical shape than Joe Biden is now, just not only by virtue of her being younger, right? And I think that this actually is playing well for Joe Biden right now. Of course, that is subject to change if the economy makes that V-shaped recovery or makes a really good recovery in the third quarter. But how do you think that this is all playing for Joe Biden, given that he's not having to go through the spring and summer wear and tear of this national campaign?
First of all, I wouldn't say that's so much of a conspiracy theory as it is just a theory. I think when you think of conspiracy theories, there's a little bit more malevolence and maliciousness that goes into it. Um, but I, I would probably lean towards agreeing that Joe Biden sort of being um, on the sidelines here is good for him because the more he talks, the worse he looks. And having something that's edited and polished through a podcast is ultimately better for him because once you have those live interviews with him, then all of a sudden you're basically having to get his comm shot to explain away why he was talking about, say, on Jimmy Kimmel wearing a Philadelphia Phillies hat is how he gets his wife to bed. Like,
Or or like licking his fingers on screen while he's
yeah,
doing this stuff. Just
it's
weird
just, I
things,
mean,
man.
it's just, yeah, obviously no one wants a pandemic to happen. People don't want others to die unless you really are an inherently evil person. But if we were looking at obviously the political dynamics here and who's like coming out better, I mean, yeah, sure, I guess you could say that Joe Biden is looking, he's in at least a good position by not having to lead the country. Maybe that's how we look at it, is that he's not leading the country, therefore he doesn't have to have hold responsibility for why, say, the federal government doesn't have the resources right now. Now, if he was still vice president, I don't think that would be the same case. I think you could look at both. If say this pandemic happened under the Obama administration, and say Biden was the leader of the task force, like Mike Pence is, then I think, you probably would see a little bit more um, criticism on him about how he handles himself. But at the same time, we're working in an environment where basically pretty much most media outlets are, if not opposed to Trump, at least so critical of Trump that they don't think anything he does is good. Um, and if you're working in a media outlet, you can't operate in that sense that everything that the administration is doing, regardless of what their politics are, is a bad thing. You have to look at it for its merits and understand that, say, this policy actually is a good thing for X, Y, and Z people. Um, with coronavirus, I mean, this impacts everyone, and you're never going to be able to, like, you're going to try to do your best to flatten that curve and save as many lives as possible. And at the same time, you're seeing some reporters out there showing that the curve, the flattened curve, the estimate being anywhere between 100,000 to 240,000 deaths. There have now been, at the time of this recording, we're looking around 12, 13,000 deaths, so probably a little bit higher. We're definitely under the 20,000 threshold. You're still looking at another 80,000 people, 80,000 to however many, at least a couple 100,000 people dying before uh, this thing we're really over this hump. And that, I mean, that's very grim. That's very unfortunate. And um, maybe some people say, thank God Joe Biden isn't president, because then maybe, either this would be worse, or maybe there's some people who think maybe he'd be better at the job. We have no idea of knowing, because this has never happened before. We'd have no idea. We just don't.
Yeah, and I think it plays favorably for Joe Biden just because it makes it more of a referendum on Trump and the Trump administration and not necessarily Joe Biden, right? Ben Shapiro's pointing this out, that the problem with the 2016 election that everyone got wrong is everyone thought it was going to be a referendum on Donald Trump and the way he acts and the way he talks, things of that nature, but it ended up being a referendum on Hillary Clinton and her corruption, or her perceived corruption, even from those on the left, right? And I think that Joe Biden is very, very smart in setting up this fake coronavirus task force, right? He's doing the walk and the talk of someone who would be running an administration to say, like, hey, listen, I've been here before. Here's the deal. I dealt with Ebola, right? Like that's what
Is that
he'd
your
be
Ben
saying.
Shapiro impression?
No. That was just Joe Biden. The name of his podcast is "Here's the Deal" because he always says, "Here's the deal." And I think it's smart for him because it's impossible to prove the counterfactual, right? When
That
you
sounded
actually
more like Ben Shapiro than it did Joe Biden. Just saying.
oh, I can do a Ben Shapiro later for you if you want off camera. I don't think I
Okay.
want to get in too much trouble because they still let me contribute over there every once in a while. Don't want to get in trouble with the boss man. But it's impossible to prove the counterfactual in these situations, right?
Right.
That he's doing the walk and the talk of someone who's running an administration. And if you actually look at his program, it's no different than the federal government's priorities right now. And there's no program that he lays forward in his podcast or his live streams that would fundamentally change the effectiveness of the federal government's response. So I think it's smart
And
political
maybe that's a
maneuvers.
testament, and maybe that's a testament to the fact that the deep state is still at play. If you want to talk about, like, the deep state and, like, government bureaucracy still at work, is that regardless of President Trump's mission to drain the swamp, there's still a lot of elements of the federal government that would handle things exactly the same regardless of whether he was president or not. So, and actually, you're seeing a lot of critics on the right start to say that, hey, the deep state is at play right now, giving Trump bad advice to basically shut down the entire economy and hurt his election chances. Uh, I think that's obviously a little bit more cynical take to look at in that regard, but at the same time, that's very much a real criticism being made about the federal government's response, is that they are working day and night to make sure that Trump doesn't win re-election.
And it's actually crazy to see even some liberals make this point, right? I was watching Joe Rogan's podcast with Eric Weinstein. I think he's an interesting guy, an interesting thinker, both of them. And he was saying, that you want to talk about the deep state? Well, let's talk about the international deep state. Let's talk about the WHO and how they're just completely ignoring Taiwan, right? Let's talk about the CDC, how they completely botched this thing, and their messaging themselves has been mixed on the use of masks and things like that. So yeah, I definitely think that there is a valid critique of this deep state, or at least the public health experts that function or at least their political programs, function as a tool of the left wing. Obviously, we don't want them to be ignored in any way, shape, or form in this response. Their input is very, very valuable, as we've seen from Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci. And I don't know if Anthony Fauci has, but I know that Deborah Birx has worked in many administrations, both Democrat and Republican, to make the goals come to fruition when we have events like this happen.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, you're up.
Oh, I was just gonna say. I mean, my one quick thing is that it's so easy to try to cast these people off as deep state if they worked in more than one administration that happen to have, say different policy sets. I think the policy themselves, especially when it comes to, say, the CDC, that doesn't change by administration for the most part. Maybe the only thing that may have changed, and that's the only different policy proposal, is Trump trying to go through with right to try. And that would be, obviously, for those who aren't familiar, that's sort of loosening the regulations and restrictions needed on experimental drugs for people dealing with terminal illnesses like cancer or say anything that say they're immunocompromised. At least try those types of medications, because you don't have an idea the drug trials that the government has to go through for anything to be released out into the market. That takes a very long time, and that's why some people are so mad at how people are talking about hydroxychloroquine, because we don't know the full benefit, we don't know the full side effects, we don't know the negatives about this medication, and testing it for that long isn't going to help people anymore, because people are dying now. And majority of doctors around the world in a survey have said that hydroxychloroquine has produced the best results in combating against coronavirus. They can't explain why, because they don't know the full science of it, and that's why they're going through drug trials right now. But at the same time, you can't just say, hey, that's wrong to give that patient that when when it's working, because it hasn't been thoroughly vetted by the government. Things don't always have to be thoroughly vetted by the government in order to be effective or work. And that's, unfortunately, that's just how some people think right now.
All right, so Siraj, you've been on our show before, but it was during CPAC, during the live stream that we did at CPAC. And wow, have things changed since then, right? We didn't even know what Joe Mentum was when we were talking at CPAC. We were looking at Bernie Sanders possibly being the Democratic nominee. All of CPAC was focused on that. And when you were on last time, you explained to our viewers what the list was. All right, so before we dive into your March Madness list tournament bracket that you've put on Twitter, which is fantastic, I've loved following it, what is the list?
So the list is, the longer form name is the power ranking of people who need their phones taken away. And it's simply that. It's based on whoever has had the worst takes of the day, particularly on Twitter. Sometimes it extends to Instagram, sometimes it extends to real life. But at the same time, there are just so many times where you read a certain tweet online and think that person really needs to have their phone taken to protect themselves from themselves. And a lot of people don't really get the cheekiness involved. And so anytime there have been a lot of times I've put people on the list and they just immediately hit me with a block. So I can't really call them out as much as I wanted to. And it's been kind of funny. In the last couple of months, I think I've been blocked by over 24 accounts, these blue check marks, who believe that, that I'm coming in to police their opinions. No, not really. But I think people should at least know that your opinions aren't good. And,
it's a prank. So, I'm messing with you.
Yeah. I mean, some people do take it really well. Just in the last week, Ilhan Omar, who I never thought would ever engage with me on anything online, hit me with the writing hand emojis. And the writing hand emojis, for those who are familiar, because I constantly get asked questions about this, I usually hit them up with 3 of the writing hand emojis to show that they're under consideration for being on the list. And so during this during this, I think it was around a week ago, that Ilhan Omar tweeted out something. She tweeted out the word "Subhanallah," which means "good God" in in the context that she used it, um, in reaction to some really bad news about coronavirus. And people sort of looked at the Google definition and said, the if you want to like look at just the particular um, say inference or the definition on Google, it would just say like God is good or like God be praised. And people were thinking that she was reacting positively to bad news, which is obviously a very cynical look to take on it because I mean like we can make criticisms about Ilhan Omar's positions and how she feels about say the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but in this particular case, I was actually defending her, and so she hit me with the writing hand emojis and started trolling me about the list. And it was like one of the funniest things that I think has ever happened to me because someone who was part of the squad and I never really thought would get in on the joke in on the joke and was trolling me as a result, and everybody was having a blast with it. And so that's just like kind of one of the examples in which people actually take it well. Um, and we just had like a friendly back and forth exchange, but if we're going to talk about the March Madness, which I'm sure is your next question, I can get into that too, and that's something that I think is probably I probably might only do it once a year. I don't think I can do that every month. That's too much.
No, it's way too much, and I totally understand that. Even if we get one Mad List bracket per year, we will be plenty happy. And it's it's good to hear that from Ilhan Omar because I didn't actually see that on your Twitter. That's hilarious. That's funny that she did it well because
really
obviously
funny.
she meant that sarcastically. Like we can talk about all
Yeah,
day long about her bad policies and certain letters she wrote to certain individuals helping certain terrorists.
yeah.
But her taking it well. I mean, it's shocking how many people take this so seriously, like a personal attack coming from you and your, I guess if you want to call them Habibis, your minions, right?
Yeah.
It's hilarious. And we're recording this segment on Wednesday before the final results are known or at least made official, right? But right now, Jennifer Rubin is just shredding AOC. And she's done
Absolutely
this
shredding it.
to every other opponent. And I made a tweet earlier on about a month or two ago, right? That like my politics is just becoming the inverse of whatever Jennifer Rubin says, you know? And she's just absolutely bat loony crazy, right? And it really wasn't an easy road for her to get here, right? She took down Jamil Hill. She took down Max Boot. I mean, these folks are notorious for their incredibly bad takes on Twitter. It's pretty amazing to see how dominating she's been in the tournament. Explain why you think that is. Explain why you think Jennifer Rubin is going to come out on top if you do think that she's going to end up beating AOC a few hours from now.
So Jennifer Rubin is the all-time never Trump reactionary in the sense that she markets herself as a conservative. Yet every single policy that she ends up agreeing with ends up being very liberal or very anti-conservative. And she say like the one position she might have that's still somewhat more right-leaning is her say stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's very much still in the conservative range. Um, but at the same time, she is out with like a very redundant and mundane take about the Trump administration and how everything that they're doing is evil or malicious or wrong, and everybody needs to resign or get fired, and it's just there's only so much of that you can really take, and so she as well as Max Boot have become the sort of pinnacle, the faces of that Never Trump movement of people who just do not care about what the Trump administration is doing, whether it's right or wrong. They just immediately cast it off as wrong. And another thing, and I didn't point this out in the previous question that you asked, was that the list was actually started in early December last year because George Conway quote tweeted his wife Kellyanne about Trump, and it was like something about she was tweeting about something about Joe Biden not needing the help of or Trump needing the help of the Ukrainian government, and George comes in here and be like, your boss sure did like needed help from the Ukrainian government, and I was just like, oh God, this guy needs his phone taken right now. And that's how the power ranking started. I just
That's your
literally just
marriage, dude. Take your you
that's
put down the
that
phone.
is just something I just was like, of all the things you put out on Twitter, that's the thing. And uh that was like, all right, I need to take this guy's phone. He should not be tweeting this out. You got to call your wife and talk about this stuff. Don't air that out in public. You just can't do that.
Yeah, as a married man yourself, how do you think that type of interaction would have played for you in your marriage? Right? That's
Oh, if
the
you're the only way I could see that as being something he felt comfortable doing was that they're like basically not together anymore, which I have no evidence to prove is actually the case. They haven't actually said anything publicly, and I don't want to speculate whether they're actually together or not. But like that's the type of thing where it's either like pretty much either done, over and done with, or it's on the edge of being done with, and you just don't care anymore, and you're trying to push it over the edge. Um, because like I would never do that. I mean, I got married almost almost 5 months ago, and this is this is not how couples should interact. Like dunking on each other playfully is fine, but like, man, that seemed a little bit much.
Yeah, that
Just a
was
little much.
definitely malicious. Yeah, you walk right into a Kellyanne Conway backhand as soon as you walk
Yeah,
through the door. If
like
that's the
George is
case,
definitely like if they're still together, like George has been sleeping on the couch ever since.
you know what, and you can't blame Kellyanne for that. You know, if you did that early on in your marriage, I mean, man, you'd be rivaling Kim Kardashian for the shortest marriage of all time,
Seriously.
and for good reason, Siraj, if you did something like that. Also, I got to talk about Jamel Hill, right?
Mhm.
I think that she was dramatically underseeded.
You know,
What
the
made you
reason
put
I
her at
yeah,
14? And like, how do you think
14.
she performed relative to your expectations?
So here's the thing, and this is something I did not consider, was that people were voting based on what their current performance was. So Jamel Hill, she had made the list maybe like once or twice before the actual bracket came out, and then during the actual tournament, she came out with that Robert Kraft take about how she has to remind everyone that he's friends with Donald Trump while he's delivering all these N95 masks from China on his team plane back to the United States. And I actually think I seated Jamel Hill properly because the only other time that she made the list was like very beginning of February, and it was around the Super Bowl, and she hadn't made it since. So I see these um, particular individuals based on how consistent they were in making the list, and so it's very much operates like March Madness. It's like your RPI, how you know the strengths of opponent, your win loss record, your strength of schedule, and your strength of victory. Like she just didn't have that strong of a resume in the beginning, but I can tell that people really did not like her takes. It's just that they didn't meet a certain standard, and this is the thing that people don't fully understand is that like why isn't Trump at number one every day? And I'm like, well, there's a certain standard they have to meet them individually. It's like you're
It's
racing against
expected. It's no
yourself.
longer a hot bad take if it's every single take.
Right. Exactly. So like, um, say for example, and I heard this one Twitter user, Tony Posnanski, who's a big Trump reply guy, very much hates Trump, you know, tells everybody to F off and then like draws stick figures um, and sells them. And I put him at like number 27 on like a top 40. And then he was really puzzled as how like his take, which was like the same as someone else, and the other person was ranked higher, like it's all about personal expectations. Like this person in particular, I have very either low or very high expectations of, and so if they meet or exceed that, then they deserve a certain place on the list. So, um, you know, for example, Bill Mitchell, I don't always put him that high up, but when he has like an exceedingly dumb take, then that's when I got to seize on it. And so he's been uh, he's been making number one a lot in the last few weeks because his takes have been exceedingly dumb, and just he's needed to be called out on it. However, I will say this is that the Communist Party of China, or the Chinese Communist Party, anytime their propaganda seeps into American news media outlets, they're definitely going on the list. So like the NBC News tweet from this week about how the U.S. has now surpassed 12,000 deaths, and now like China's reporting that they've had zero deaths in or zero cases in Beijing, which is obviously like, you're gonna trust information coming out of China in that case? Okay, that's fine. I'm putting you on the list because you shouldn't have your phone right now. So it's just it's become tireless in that regard. And during quarantine in particular, I felt like my brain has been melting because there have been just so many bad takes, and people have had so much time to just stir in their thoughts, and they just pop off and just let something go on Twitter without thinking twice about it. And as a result, I got to take their phone. Like, thankfully, Boris Johnson is on the mend. But when people were like laughing at his getting sick and going into intensive care, I had to put people on the list. And here's the thing, I am
You had to
friendly
do
with
it to him. You had to
yeah.
do it
And
to him.
here's the thing, I am friendly with a lot of people on the left, like Ken Klippenstein, Jordan Knoll, Wajah Ali. Um, I'm friendly and friends with those people. Uh, they understand when I put them on the list, they usually they usually don't take it personally. And they know that I know that I think that they messed up, but we can still be friends about it and it's all good. But it's just like they had a bad take, and like that's it. Like there's no like personal shots I'm levying against you, and I will always usually uh uh, for some people, I will DM them and just send them the tweet. I'm like, hey, buddy, I'm just letting you know I'm on the list.
And I think that's that's the beautiful thing about it, right? The exceedingly dumb take, and there go the writing hands. The writing hands are coming out and coming straight for you. It's so good. It's just such an ingenious thing. Like, oh, this person needs their phone taken away. Needs it taken away now. So the final
Yeah.
four, right? Jennifer Rubin, Jim Acosta, AOC, and Bill Mitchell. Three
Hmm.
number one seeds. I mean, you pretty much seem to nail it with the seeding, even though I'm giving you a hard time about Jamil Hill, right? Is this what you thought it
Well,
would be? How did you
no.
think it would turn out?
I actually thought Donald Trump would come out of the East region. It ended up being Jim Acosta who beat Jamel Hill in the Elite Eight. Um, or no, it wasn't Jamel Hill. It was Carlos Maza, who was the 9 seed. I didn't think it would be a 9 versus 3 matchup, and Jennifer Rubin gave Jamel Hill the buzzsaw in the West final. So, you know, I thought it was going to be Trump, Rubin, Mitchell, and then the Midwest region was sort of a toss up because that could have been anyone. I really thought it was going to be probably Charlie Kirk coming out of that, and he was ranked as a 2 seed, ended up being AOC, and
Really,
I
you
guess
thought
I have
Charlie
to.
Kirk was going to beat Candace Owens? I mean, Charlie Kirk has like this very formulaic way of tweeting, but like
He
his
does.
takes are relatively milk toast, right? If it's based on expectations, like his tweets lately have been
Sure.
relatively milk toast. Like whenever Candace Owens comes out and tweets, like sometimes her tweets are hilarious and fire. Like the one that she did about Ilhan Omar, like I personally thought it was hilarious. But
I
there
don't
are
know about
some,
that one because she blocked me.
yeah, because there has every once in a while it just comes out and it's like, wow, that is an exceedingly bad take. Like AOC, okay, yeah, she has a litany of bad progressive takes, but that's because I'm a conservative and she's a progressive, right? It's her messaging is no different than what's coming out of every single classroom that I'm enrolled in, whether
Sure.
it's in person or via Zoom lecture now at UC Berkeley, right? They're like pretty
AOC
standard
is actually
progressive,
very good on Twitter. Like
right?
even if you disagree with her policies, like she has a very good Twitter presence, and I think very she if there's anything to take away from her Twitter presence, or whatever she's done in Congress, maybe you could take away from the fact that maybe she hasn't done a whole lot. She's tried to get the Green New Deal past the finish line. That hasn't really worked out well for her. Taking away her legislative record, which has been very slim at this point. Um, her actual contribution to the Democratic Party would be teaching a lot of these older members of Congress and possibly even senators how to have a better messaging strategy on social media because she is very good at presenting her message. She started doing these Instagram lives, and all of a sudden, a bunch of 2020 Democratic presidential candidates started trying to do these Instagram lives. They weren't obviously able to do it very well, but I can tell you, at the very least, if she runs for president, whether it be 2024 or 2028, I can guarantee that she will have a lot of success because she has just done a very good job of marketing herself.
Yeah, and I think that's a good take. I don't think you'd be on the list for that take. So so what's next for the list, right? Is it taking a break after this? Is this the crescendo of the list, or are you continuing it right away? Are you stepping back and you will resume it in December of this year to kind of develop the seating before March? What's next for the
Oh
list?
no, no, no. There's no. Here's the thing. I want to keep this continuous, but I'm trying to think of the right balance here because I don't know what that is because I thought about doing it for a week. Turns out I really just took a week off and then went back to doing it daily. And now I've done three in the last day in the last 3 days. The thing is, and this is what I'm not sure of, is should I'm trying to figure out ways to sort of expand and make sure that if people wanted to actually learn, get a good catch up of what happened in the past week, that they can get a quick recap. And I might actually do something where I expand more into video to sort of give you like, here are the 5 worst tweets of the week because like that's something that would be like a nice icing on the cake of the list to give at least a nice presentation. Because I really do feel like, YouTube has been around for, you know, 14, 15 years and has made a lot of people successful. And I think that the only way to get the list to expand and get people to understand what it is to expand at least on video. And that's something I feel like I'm actually fairly decent at because I can have in on top of actually being in front of the camera, I can at least go on the back end and produce and edit and do all those sort of things where it's needed to present a good product because I do that for my job already. It's just adding, say, like a side hustle. So that's sort of what my plans are right now is to expand more on YouTube, keep the list going on Twitter, keep my Patreon going because if people want to at least read explainers, they can at least subscribe to it. You can still get the list on Twitter for free. You can still see what tweets got them on the list. But if you want to see like my actual analysis, whether it be short or long, you can subscribe to my Patreon and you can have access to it. I've thought about scaling Patreon back because it's a huge burden now to have people now paying for your content, and then you having to constantly fulfill that. And it's like having shareholders of a company. You constantly want to make sure that you're reassuring them that whatever you're doing meets their expectation. And I I just want to. I'm obviously doing this because I like doing it, but at the same time, now you're feeling the added pressure and the added burden of making sure you meet other people's expectations of what the list should be. And so that I guess that's just like a trade-off that you have to come to grips with as soon as you start making a little bit of change, a little bit of money off of it.
Yeah, I think I've seen your Patreon posts of recapping what's going on in the bracket, and I'm really glad that you're going to continue to do that because I think it's really fun. It provides politics is stupid. Politics is stupid. It provides a
100%.
levity. It provides a levity to politics that is very much needed during this time. And you know what? I already got a name for this little list podcast. It's called Shitter. Right? It's shitty Twitter. And
I mean, professionally probably can't put that, but
I know, I
it could be
know.
the unofficial name.
The unofficial name is the shitter. But I'm glad you brought up your Patreon. Plug your Patreon for us. I
Yeah, you
think.
just look up my name, Siraj Hashmi, on Patreon, and you should be able to find that I'm creating power rankings. I'm probably going to consolidate. I have 3 different tiers, but curating content for 3 different tiers actually takes a lot of time. So I'm going to actually probably scale that back to just one. And if you just pay to subscribe, you can have access to all the content that your heart desires.
All right. Well, we are out of time. We are actually well over time, but I've had so much fun talking to you. I'm glad that you were able to join me. As you said, if you want, or as he said, if you want full access to Siraj Hashmi and everything he does, go sign up for his Patreon. Follow him on Twitter at Siraj A Hashmi. Make sure
Subscribe
you
to the YouTube channel too.
Yes, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure that you keep up on the list. Check out how those all those bouts in the March Madness tournament turned out, because by the time that this is released, it will be all over and done with. So, Siraj, again, thank you for coming on the show. We were glad to have you back, and we hope to see you soon.
I appreciate you having me on, Brad.